The dining room buzzed with laughter and conversation, but all I could hear was the scrape of my chair being pulled away from the main table. My sister-in-law, Vanessa, pointed toward the corner of the room. "We've set up the kids' table over there. Margaret, we need the space for Dad's business associates." I stood frozen, my plate of food growing cold in my hands as I watched my husband Thomas nod in agreement, avoiding my eyes. I was 53 years old, had been married to Thomas for 26 years, and was being relegated to sit with the children at my father-in-law's 75th birthday celebration. The shame burned hotter than the candles on Harold's elaborate cake. I sat down among the sticky-fingered children, my silk dress out of place among cartoon character t-shirts and chocolate-smeared faces. That humiliation would have been enough, but it was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, in this same dining room, filled with these same people, Harold's lawyer would call my name, and the entire family would turn to stare at me in stunned silence. But let me start from the beginning. Before the lawyer's announcement, before the kids' table, before I discovered what 26 years of marriage had really meant to the Coleman family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I met Thomas Coleman at a charity auction for the Children's Hospital where I worked as a pediatric nurse. He was charming, impeccably dressed, and spoke with a quiet confidence that made everyone around him lean in to listen. The son of real estate magnate Harold Coleman, Thomas had been groomed from birth to take over the family business. I was neither wealthy nor connected, just a nurse with a passion for helping children and a small apartment in the unfashionable part of town. When he asked for my number, I nearly looked behind me to check if he was speaking to someone else. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Dinners at restaurants I couldn't pronounce, weekends at his beach house, theater tickets in the front row. I was dazzled, not just by the wealth, but by how Thomas seemed to see me when so many men had looked right through me. "You have an authenticity that's rare in my world," he told me on our third date. I believed him. 6 months later, he proposed with a diamond ring that felt heavier than my hand. The wedding was featured in society pages. 300 guests, most of whom I'd never met. My side was noticeably smaller. My parents, both teachers, my sister and her husband, a handful of friends from the hospital. I remember standing in the bathroom of the grand ballroom in my custom gown, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the life I was stepping into. My mother found me there, straightening my veil with steady hands. "Remember who you are," she said firmly. "They're lucky to have you." I nodded, believing her completely. Harold Coleman stood imposingly tall at the reception, shaking my hand rather than embracing me. "Welcome to the family," he said, his voice neither warm nor cold. Thomas has always been impulsive, but I trust he knows what he's doing. His wife Eleanor kissed the air near my cheek, her perfume expensive and suffocating. "The nurse," she said, as if identifying a species. "How quaint." I smiled through it all, telling myself it didn't matter. I had Thomas. We were in love. The rest would fall into place. The first years were a blur of adjustment. I left my job at the hospital at Thomas's insistence. "My wife doesn't need to work," he said, as if conferring a great privilege. I filled my days with charity committees approved by Eleanor, interior, decorating our penthouse apartment, and learning the intricate social codes of Thomas's world. I made mistakes, used the wrong fork, mentioned politics at dinner, wore a dress that Eleanor deemed trying too hard. Each misstep was met with a gentle correction from Thomas. "That's not how we do things," he would say, his voice kind but firm. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of resilience and unexpected twists of fate. I thought I was adapting well, finding my place in the Coleman world. I hosted dinner parties that Eleanor grudgingly approved of. I managed the household staff with efficiency. I accompanied Thomas to business functions and stood by his side, smiling and making appropriate conversation. I learned which topics were acceptable, travel, art, real estate, and which were not, my nursing career, my family's modest background, politics. I became what I thought they wanted: poised, reserved, appropriate. Children were expected, of course. When none came, despite years of trying, I felt the first real fissure in my marriage. Thomas never blamed me outright, but I saw the disappointment. In his eyes, heard the whispers when Eleanor thought I couldn't hear. The bloodline ends with Thomas unless he does something about it. I suggested adoption. Thomas refused immediately. Colemans aren't raised by strangers, he said, closing the discussion. Instead, we became the doting aunt and uncle to his brother Richard's children. Richard had married well, a woman from another wealthy family with the right connections, and most importantly to Harold, the ability to produce 3 perfect grandchildren. Vanessa, Richard's wife, never let me forget it. Her casual cruelty was always veiled in concern. "It must be so empty, your beautiful home without children," she would say at family gatherings. "Thank goodness you have us." I poured my maternal instincts into my nieces and nephews, bringing thoughtful gifts, remembering their interests, showing up at school performances. I thought they loved me in return. Perhaps they did, in the distant way children love a relative who tries too hard. But they were Colemans first, taught from birth about family hierarchy, about who mattered and who was peripheral. And in the Coleman family, I was always peripheral. The family business was everything. Coleman properties had been built by Harold from nothing, or so the family mythology claimed. In reality, Harold had started with a substantial inheritance, but the story of the self-made man was too powerful to correct. Thomas and Richard worked side by side under their father's watchful eye, expanding the company's reach across 3 states. Dinner conversations revolved around acquisitions, developments, competitors. I learned to nod and look interested, though my suggestions were never solicited and rarely acknowledged when offered. Harold ruled the family like he ruled his business, with absolute authority and an expectation of unwavering loyalty. Sunday dinners at the Coleman estate were mandatory. Holidays were scheduled years in advance, with no exceptions for my family's traditions. My parents were invited occasionally, seated far from the center of the table. Their attempts at conversation met with polite disinterest. After my father's stroke, they stopped coming. "It's too stressful for him," my mother explained. I understood the unspoken truth. They didn't feel welcome. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Coleman estate sat on 5 manicured acres, a neo-colonial mansion with white columns and perfect symmetry. Inside, the decor was traditional, expensive, and unchanged since Eleanor had overseen its completion 30 years earlier. My favorite room was the library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather chairs. I would often retreat there during family gatherings, finding solace in the quiet and the smell of old books. It was there that I first overheard Harold speaking about me. "She's been a disappointment," he said to someone I couldn't see. "Thomas could have married anyone, connected us to the Richardsons or the Wexlers. Instead, he chose a nurse with no family connections and couldn't even give us grandchildren. At least she's learned to stay quiet." I should have confronted him, should have defended myself. Instead, I silently closed the door and walked away, the words settling into my bones like a diagnosis. That night, I asked Thomas if he regretted marrying me. We were in our bedroom, the city lights twinkling below our window. He looked surprised by the question. "Of course not," he said, taking my hand. "You're my wife. Not, I love you. Not, you're everything to me. Just, you're my wife, a statement of fact, a role fulfilled." I told myself it was enough. The years passed. I found purpose in charity work, particularly with children's literacy programs. I suggested to Thomas that we could fund a new children's wing at the hospital where I'd worked. "The family foundation has its commitments," he replied dismissively. I had access to generous allowances but no real say in family philanthropy. Still, I carved out my small corner of meaning, showing up at the hospital weekly to read to sick children. The nurses, some former colleagues, welcomed me warmly. For a few hours each week, I was Margaret again, not Mrs. Thomas Coleman. My 40th birthday came and went with a tasteful dinner arranged by Eleanor. My 50th with a similarly appropriate celebration. Thomas gave me jewelry on both occasions, beautiful pieces selected by his assistant. By our 25th wedding anniversary, we had settled into a comfortable distance. We operated as a team in public, the perfect couple at galas and business functions. In private, we moved around each other with polite detachment. We hadn't shared a bedroom in years, though few knew this. "Thomas snores," I would explain when necessary. The truth was more complicated and far less discussable. Throughout it, Harold remained the center of the Coleman universe. As he approached 75, his health began to falter. Heart problems, according to Richard, though details were kept strictly within the inner circle of the family. I learned about his first hospitalization from the housekeeper. Thomas hadn't thought to tell me himself. "Dad doesn't want a fuss," he explained when I confronted him. Translation: "You're not important enough to be informed." Harold's 75th birthday celebration was planned for months. Eleanor oversaw every detail of the party: the caterer, the flowers, the guest list. 200 people would fill their home to honor the family patriarch. I offered to help and was politely rebuffed. "We have it under control," Eleanor said. "Just make sure you wear something appropriate." I chose a conservative blue silk dress that I knew she would approve of. The desire to fit in, to avoid criticism, was deeply ingrained after 26 years. The night of the party arrived. I stood by Thomas's side as guests streamed in: business associates, political connections, family friends. I smiled and nodded and played my part perfectly. Harold barely acknowledged me, kissing my cheek distractedly before moving on to more important guests. I was used to it. I had long ago accepted my place in the hierarchy. The dining room had been transformed. For the occasion, 3 long tables formed a U shape, with Harold and Eleanor at the head. Place cards marked each seat, a Coleman tradition that established the pecking order in visible form. I searched for my name near Thomas, then near Richard and Vanessa, then increasingly desperately along the rows of seats. It wasn't until Vanessa approached that I realized what was happening. "We've set up the kids' table over there, Margaret. We need the space for Dad's business associates." The kids' table. In 26 years as a Coleman, I had never been so publicly humiliated. I looked to Thomas, expecting him to object, to insist I be seated properly. He avoided my gaze and nodded toward the corner where a small table was indeed set up for the youngest attendees. My place card sat propped beside a 7-year-old's. "There must be some mistake," I said quietly to Thomas. "It's just for dinner, Margaret," he replied, his voice low. "Dad wanted his key investors close. It's important for the business." The business. Always the business. Never me. I walked to the kids' table with as much dignity as I could muster, feeling the curious glances of guests who knew exactly what this placement meant. My nieces and nephews looked uncomfortable as I sat down among them, too old to sit at the children's table myself, but apparently not important enough to sit with the adults. I made small talk with the children, helped cut their food, wiped, spilled juice. All while watching the main table laughing, talking, raising glasses and toasts I couldn't hear. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself and walked to the powder room. I locked the door and stared at my reflection. 26 years had passed since I'd married into this family. My hair was streaked with gray now, my face lined with the years. What was I doing here? What had I become? The woman who stared back at me looked lost, diminished. I barely recognized her. A knock on the door startled me. Margaret? It was Barbara, Harold's longtime secretary and the closest thing I had to a friend in the Coleman circle. Are you all right? I opened the door. Barbara slipped inside, concern evident on her face. I saw where they seated you, she said quietly. It's not right. It's fine, I replied automatically. The Coleman way. Don't make a scene, don't show emotion. Barbara took my hands in hers. No, it's not fine, and there's something you should know. She glanced at the door, making sure we were truly alone. Harold changed his will last month. I wasn't supposed to know, but I handle all. His paperwork. She hesitated. Margaret, there's something big coming. I can't say more, but just don't let them push you around tonight. It won't be like this forever. Before I could ask what she meant, the door opened again. Eleanor stood there, her expression cold. The cake is being served, she said. How nice of you to hide in here while everyone celebrates Harold. Barbara squeezed my hand quickly before slipping past Eleanor. I followed, puzzled by her words, but too well trained to show it. Back at the kids' table, I ate my cake in silence, watching Thomas laugh with his brother, watching Harold hold court at the center of the room. I had spent half my life trying to belong in this family, and tonight they had shown me definitively that I never would. The question was, what would I do about it? 2 weeks later, Harold Coleman died quietly in his sleep. The funeral was attended by the same guests who had celebrated his birthday. I stood beside Thomas, dressed appropriately in black, accepting condolences for a loss that, if I was honest with myself, I hardly felt. The man had never seen me, never valued me, never welcomed me truly into his family. Yet social convention demanded I play the grieving daughter-in-law. After the service, the immediate family gathered at the Coleman estate. The reading of the will was scheduled for that afternoon, an old-fashioned tradition that Harold had insisted upon. He wants to see their faces, Eleanor had once told me, not realizing the cruelty in the statement. Now he would never see the impact of his final decisions. The family solicitor, Mr. Winters, arrived carrying a leather portfolio. We gathered in the dining room, the same room where I had been banished to the kids' table. The symmetry was not lost on me. This time I was allowed to sit at the main table, though at the far end. Thomas sat near his mother, with Richard and Vanessa opposite. The children were not present for this adult affair. Mr. Winters cleared his throat and began reading the legal preamble, the formal language washing over us. I let my mind wander, assuming I already knew the outcome. The business would go to Thomas and Richard, the estate to Eleanor, trust funds to the grandchildren, perhaps some token bequest to me, jewelry or artwork that Eleanor didn't particularly want. I had no expectations beyond that. Now to the distribution of assets, Mr. Winters said, bringing my attention back to the present. The Coleman family estate and all personal property therein I leave to my wife, Eleanor. No surprises there. Eleanor nodded slightly, as if accepting her due. My shares in Coleman Properties, representing 60% ownership of the company, I leave. Mr. Winters paused, adjusting his glasses. The room held its collective breath. This was the moment that mattered, the future of the family business. I leave to my daughter-in-law, Margaret Coleman. The silence that followed was absolute. I must have misheard. Everyone must have misheard. I looked up to find every eye in the room fixed on me. Thomas's face had drained of color. Richard's mouth hung open in shock. Vanessa gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. And Eleanor looked as if she might collapse. There must be some mistake, Thomas said, his voice strangled. Mr. Winters shook his head. There is no mistake. Harold was very clear about his wishes. He continued reading. To my sons, Thomas and Richard, I leave 20% ownership, each with the stipulation that all major business decisions must be approved by the majority shareholder, Margaret Coleman. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room began to spin slightly. 60% of Coleman Properties, control of the family business. Harold had left it not to his sons, not to his wife, but to me, the nurse, the outsider, the woman sent, to sit at the kids' table. This is outrageous, Eleanor found her voice at last. Harold would never do this. I assure you, Mrs. Coleman, these are Harold's explicit instructions, made of sound mind and witnessed properly. Mr. Winters pulled another document from his portfolio. He also left this letter for Margaret, to be read privately. The envelope he handed me felt impossibly heavy. I took it with trembling hands as the chaos erupted around me. Richard was shouting about contesting the will. Vanessa was in tears. Thomas sat in stunned silence, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. And perhaps he was. May I have a moment? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Without waiting for a response, I rose and walked to the library, my refuge, in this house for so many years. I closed the heavy door behind me, muffling the sounds of the family's distress. The envelope was sealed with the Coleman family crest. I broke it open and unfolded a single sheet of paper, recognizing Harold's distinctive handwriting. Margaret. By now you know what I've done. I imagine my family is not taking it well. They never did handle surprises gracefully. You wonder why. I owe you that explanation at least. For 26 years, I watched you navigate a world that never welcomed you. I watched you maintain your dignity when Eleanor was cruel, when Vanessa was dismissive, when my sons took you for granted. I watched you continue to show kindness to a family that offered you none in return. What you never knew is that I watched you outside our family as well. I saw your work with the children at the hospital. I had reports of your kindness, your intelligence, your careful management of resources. I recognized something in you that neither of my sons possesses, true leadership paired with compassion. Coleman Properties was built to last generations, not to satisfy the egos of those who happen to bear the Coleman name. My sons were born to privilege and have never known anything else. They lack the hunger, the perspective, the humanity needed to lead this company into the future. You were not my choice for Thomas. I made that clear, to my shame. But over the years, you became my choice for this company's future. You have the outsider's perspective, the strength forged by years of being underestimated, and the wisdom to make decisions based on more than profit. The children's table was Eleanor's idea. I allowed it to happen, curious to see how you would respond. You showed more grace in that humiliation than my family has shown you in 26 years. This is not charity, Margaret. This is not pity. This is the most selfish decision I've ever made, ensuring that my life's work continues in the most capable hands I know. The family will fight you. Remember that you are stronger than they know. Than you know, perhaps. Harold Coleman. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Tears blurred my vision, not of joy or grief, but of something more complex, validation after decades of invisibility. Harold had seen me all along, not as the nurse who married above her station, but as a woman of worth, of capability, of substance. The door opened without a knock. Thomas stood there, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. What did he say? He demanded, gesturing to the letter in my hands. Why would he do this? I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. He said he was investing in the future, I answered, my voice calm, and that he had faith in my leadership. Leadership? Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You know nothing about real estate, nothing about business. I know more than you think. I stood, feeling a strange new confidence straightening my spine. I've listened for 26 years, Thomas. I've watched and learned while being ignored. It's amazing how much people reveal when they think you don't matter. He stared at me, recognition dawning slowly in his eyes. You can't seriously be considering taking control. This is my birthright, our family legacy. It's a business, Thomas, not a birthright. I moved toward the door. And according to your father, it's now my business. You can't do this to me, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. We're married. The irony was painful. Now he remembered we were married. Now it mattered. Yes, I agreed. We are married. And for the first time in 26 years, I'm wondering what exactly that means to you. I walked past him back to the dining room. The family had not calmed in my absence. Eleanor was on the phone, presumably with another lawyer. Richard was pacing furiously. Vanessa sat frozen, her perfect makeup streaked with tears. Mr. Winters looked relieved to see me. Mrs. Coleman, there are several documents requiring your signature when you're ready. I'm ready now, I said, taking the seat at the head of the table, Harold's seat. The symbolism was lost on no one. Eleanor gasped audibly. Richard stopped pacing. Thomas, entering behind me, stood frozen in the doorway. As I signed each document Mr. Winters placed before me, I felt a transformation taking place, not just in my circumstances, but in my very being. The woman who had silently accepted her place at the kids' table was gone. In her place was someone new, someone I was just beginning to recognize. What happens now? Richard demanded as I signed the final page. I looked up at the family that had never truly been mine. Now, I said, we have a conversation about the future of Coleman Properties. I'll be at the office tomorrow morning at 9. I expect both of you to be there. I nodded to Thomas and Richard. We have a lot to discuss. You can't possibly think we'll accept this, Vanessa sputtered. You don't have to accept it, I replied evenly. The law does. Harold did. That's enough for now. I stood, gathering my purse and the envelope containing Harold's letter. Thank you, Mr. Winters. I'll be in touch about next steps. As I walked toward the door, Eleanor called after me. Margaret, where are you going? I turned back, looking at the woman who had dismissed me for nearly 3 decades. Home, Eleanor. I'm going home. And tomorrow, I'm going to work. I left the Coleman estate with my head high, feeling the weight of their stares but no longer burdened by their judgment. In the car, I finally allowed myself to feel the magnitude of what had happened. Harold Coleman, the man I thought had never seen me, had entrusted me with everything he valued most. He had seen not just my patience and loyalty, but my capacity for leadership, my untapped potential. The tears came then. Tears of release, of vindication, of overwhelming possibility. For 26 years, I had made myself smaller to fit into the Coleman world. Now that world was mine to reshape. The irony was both painful and exquisite. I drove not to the penthouse I shared with Thomas, but to a hotel downtown. I needed space to think, to plan, to become the woman Harold believed I could be. As I checked in, the receptionist asked, "How long will you be staying with us, Mrs. Coleman?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure yet," I answered truthfully. "I'm just beginning." The morning after Harold's will reading, I woke in my hotel room with a strange sense of calm. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions solely for myself. I ordered room service coffee and sat by the window, watching the city come alive below. My phone had been buzzing consistently since I left the Coleman estate. Thomas, Eleanor, even Richard had called repeatedly. I hadn't answered. Not yet. I needed to understand my own mind before facing theirs. I dressed carefully in a navy suit. I had packed on instinct the night before. It wasn't a Coleman-approved outfit. Too bold, too confident, not demure enough for a wife in my position. But I was no longer just Thomas's wife. I was the majority shareholder of Coleman Properties, a company valued at over $300 million. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The Coleman Properties headquarters occupied the top 5 floors of a downtown high-rise. I had visited occasionally over the years, charity functions, holiday parties, the obligatory appearances of a dutiful wife. I had never arrived alone, never walked through the imposing glass doors as anything other than an accessory to Thomas. Today was different. The security guard in the lobby looked up in surprise as I approached. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, his tone uncertain. "I didn't know you were coming in today." "I'll be coming in every day from now on, Frank," I replied, remembering his name from the holiday parties where the staff were introduced and promptly forgotten by most of the family. "Could I trouble you for a temporary access badge until something permanent can be arranged?" Frank's eyebrows rose slightly, but his training prevailed. "Of course, Mrs. Coleman. Let me get that for you right away." Badge in hand, I rode the elevator to the executive floor. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. The elevator doors opened to reveal a spacious reception area where a young woman sat behind a sleek desk. Her eyes widened at the sight of me. "Mrs. Coleman, we weren't expecting." She trailed off, clearly unsure of protocol. "Good morning, Jennifer," I said, having studied the company directory that morning. "I believe Mr. Thomas and Mr. Richard are expecting me. Is Harold's office available?" Her mouth opened slightly. "Mr. Harold's office? I don't—" "It's fine, Jennifer," came a voice from the hallway. Barbara, Harold's secretary, appeared, with a folder in her arms. Her eyes met mine with unmistakable approval. "Mrs. Coleman will be using Mr. Harold's office going forward. I've taken the liberty of having it prepared." I followed Barbara down the hallway, aware of the curious glances from employees we passed. Harold's office occupied the corner of the building with panoramic views of the city. The space was imposingly masculine. Dark wood, leather furniture, golf memorabilia displayed prominently. Barbara closed the door behind us. "You knew," I said, not a question but a statement. She nodded. "I've worked for Harold for 35 years. He trusted me with many things, including his plans for you." "Why me, Barbara? After all these years of being treated like an outsider?" She set the folder on the desk. Harold was a complicated man. Publicly, he maintained family traditions, appearances, hierarchies. Privately, he observed everything. He saw how you handled yourself over the years, with dignity despite the family's treatment, and he was impressed by your work at the Children's Hospital. Did you know he was anonymously matching all your charitable donations? I hadn't known. The revelation that Harold had been watching, evaluating, seeing value in me when I believed myself invisible was still difficult to process. "This folder contains the key information you'll need today: organization charts, current projects, financial summaries. The board has been notified of the change in ownership, though I believe they're expecting Thomas to serve as your proxy." She smiled slightly. I look forward to their surprise. "Thomas and Richard will be here at 9? They arrived separately about 20 minutes ago. They're waiting in the conference room." She glanced at her watch. "It's 10 to 9 now." I took a deep breath. "Thank you, Barbara. I'd like a few minutes to review these materials before meeting with them." "Of course. Would you like coffee?" "Please. Black." After Barbara left, I sat in Harold's chair, my chair now, and opened the folder. The contents were overwhelming. Financials for dozens of properties, development plans, partnership agreements. I had absorbed snippets of business discussions over the years, but the scale of Coleman Properties suddenly felt daunting. What had Harold been thinking, entrusting this empire to me? Then I spotted a yellow sticky note in Harold's handwriting. Trust yourself, Margaret. You see what others miss. The simple message steadied me. I straightened my shoulders and began reviewing the material, making quick notes on areas that needed clarification. At precisely 9 o'clock, I gathered the folder and walked to the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see Thomas and Richard sitting on opposite sides of the table, neither speaking to the other. I paused, observing them for a moment. Thomas looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. Richard's face was flushed with anger. Both turned as I entered. Margaret, Thomas began, rising halfway from his chair. We need to discuss this rationally. I agree, I said calmly, taking the seat at the head of the table, Harold's seat, now mine. That's why I'm here. Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. This is absurd. You have no experience, no knowledge of this business. You can't possibly think you can run Coleman Properties. I don't intend to run day-to-day operations immediately, I replied. That's why we're having this meeting. I need to understand exactly what each of you handles, what projects are in progress, and how decisions have been made up to this point. And then what? Thomas asked. You'll step aside and let us continue as before? I looked at him steadily. No, Thomas. I won't be stepping aside, but I'm willing to work with both of you if you're willing to work with me. This is our family company, Richard said through gritted teeth. Our birthright. It's a business, Richard, I corrected. Him, echoing what I'd told Thomas the day before. And businesses need to adapt and evolve. From my preliminary review, Coleman Properties has been stagnant for the past 5 years. Property acquisitions are down, development has slowed, and 3 major projects are behind schedule and over budget. Their surprise at my knowledge was evident. I had always been present at family gatherings where business was discussed, always listening while being ignored. I had absorbed more than any of them realized. What exactly do you want? Thomas asked after a moment. For today, information, a complete briefing on all current projects, staffing, finances, and challenges. After that, we can discuss next steps. I opened the folder Barbara had prepared. Shall we begin with the Riverside development? I understand there are permit issues. For the next 3 hours, I listened as Thomas and Richard reluctantly walked me through the business. Their initial resistance gradually gave way to professional obligation as they explained complex deals, market conditions, and strategic challenges. I asked questions, many questions, and took detailed notes. Some of my queries clearly surprised them with their insight. Others revealed gaps in my knowledge that I didn't try to hide. By noon, a tense but functional working rhythm had established itself. Barbara arranged lunch to be brought in, and we continued. I could see both men reassessing me throughout the day, their assumptions about my capabilities shifting incrementally with each intelligent question, each quick grasp of a complex concept. The Hamilton Street properties, I said, pointing to a line item in the financial summary. Why are we holding on to buildings with such poor returns? Thomas and Richard exchanged a glance. Those are special projects of Eleanor's, Thomas finally explained. Dad always kept them despite the financial drain. Why? Another uncomfortable glance between the brothers. They're her family's old properties, Richard said reluctantly. From before she married Dad. Her father lost everything else in the 70s. These buildings are the last connection to her family's former wealth. I made a note. Sentiment over business sense. Interesting. And the tenants? These are all residential buildings in historically lower-income areas? Yes, Thomas confirmed. Mostly families who've been there for generations. Eleanor has kept the rents artificially low. This surprised me. Eleanor had never struck me as particularly charitable. I'd like to visit these properties, I decided. Next week, perhaps. Why? Richard asked suspiciously. Because they're losing money, and I want to understand why we're keeping them. I closed my notebook. I think that's enough for today. You've both been very helpful. So what happens now? Thomas asked, the question that had been hanging over the entire meeting. I considered my response carefully. For now, continue. Your current responsibilities. I'll be coming in daily to learn more about the business and assess our path forward. I'll want regular briefings from both of you, and I expect complete transparency. And if we refuse? Richard challenged. Then you'll be refusing to fulfill your duties as executives of this company, and I'll be forced to consider management changes. I met his gaze directly. I'd prefer not to start that way, Richard. The tension in the room thickened. Thomas broke it first. Margaret, could we speak privately? I nodded to Richard. We're done for today. Thank you for your time. He left reluctantly, closing the door with more force than necessary. Thomas remained standing, looking at me as if I were a stranger. What are you doing, Margaret? He asked quietly. Exactly what your father wanted me to do, taking responsibility for Coleman Properties. This isn't you. You've never shown any interest in the business before. I was never given the opportunity, I countered. How many times did I ask questions about your work, only to be given vague answers? How many times was I excluded from discussions because it was just business? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's how it's always been done in our family. And look where that's gotten us, I replied. A company that's plateaued, leadership that's complacent, and a family that treats loyalty as weakness. Thomas moved closer, his tone softening. Come home, Margaret. We can talk about this, figure out some arrangement that works for everyone. I'm not coming home tonight, Thomas. I need space to think. About what? About us? The question caught me off guard. In all the chaos of the inheritance, I had barely begun to process what it meant for my marriage. Yes, I admitted. About us. About whether there really is an us anymore. His face hardened. 26 years, and you're ready to throw it away over this? 26 years of what, Thomas? Of being tolerated? Of being relegated to the background of your life? Of being sent to the children's table at your father's birthday celebration? The hurt I'd suppressed bubbled to the surface. Did you even try to object when Vanessa did that? He looked away, the answer clear in his silence. That's what I thought, I said softly. I'll see you tomorrow, Thomas. 9 o'clock. I gathered my notes and left him standing in the conference room, his reflection in the glass wall looking smaller somehow, diminished. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern. I arrived at the office by 8 each morning, using the quiet hour before others arrived to study reports and prepare questions. Thomas and Richard maintained a professional demeanor in meetings, but watched. Me warily, waiting for mistakes, for signs of weakness. I made some errors, misunderstanding technical terms, missing industry nuances, but I acknowledged them openly and learned quickly. Barbara proved invaluable, guiding me through the complexities of corporate governance, helping me understand the company's history and culture. Harold wasn't a perfect man, she told me over late-night coffee in his, now my, office. But he built something lasting because he was willing to adapt, to learn, to listen to perspectives different from his own. He saw that quality in you. I also began meeting with department heads, project managers, site supervisors, employees who seemed startled that the new owner wanted their input. Many had never spoken directly with Harold, dealing only with Thomas or Richard. Their insights revealed a company that had grown complacent, relying on past successes rather than innovating for the future. We've proposed new sustainability initiatives for 3 years running, the head architect confided. They always get shelved as too expensive or too experimental. The affordable housing project could have been groundbreaking, a project manager told me. But we scaled it back to the point where it's just another development. Patterns emerged from these conversations, opportunities missed, innovation stifled, employees whose talents were underutilized. Coleman Properties wasn't failing, but it wasn't thriving either. It was maintaining, comfortable, profitable, but stagnant. Meanwhile, my personal life remained in limbo. I continued staying at the hotel, ignoring Eleanor's increasingly pointed messages and deflecting Thomas's attempts to discuss our situation outside of business hours. I wasn't avoiding reconciliation out of spite. I genuinely needed time to understand who I was now, what I wanted from the remainder of my life. On Friday afternoon of my second week as owner, I visited the Hamilton Street Properties, Eleanor's sentimental holdings. What I found surprised me. The buildings were old but well-maintained, the apartments modest but dignified. The tenants I met spoke of Eleanor with unexpected warmth. "Mrs. Coleman comes by every month," an elderly woman told me as she showed me her apartment. "Brings groceries for the seniors who can't get out easily. Knows all our names, our grandkids' names too." This didn't align with the Eleanor I knew. Cold, status-conscious, dismissive of those she considered beneath her. Yet here was evidence of another side to her, a generosity kept separate from her society persona. I returned to the office contemplative. Barbara was waiting with a stack of documents, requiring my signature. "Did you know about Eleanor's involvement with the Hamilton Street tenants?" I asked her. Barbara nodded. "It was her one rebellion against the society life. Those buildings belonged to her grandfather. When her father lost everything, the tenants took collections to try to help the family. They failed, of course. The financial ruin was too complete. But Eleanor never forgot their loyalty." "Why keep it secret from the family?" "Harold knew," Barbara corrected me. "He indulged it as her personal project. As for the rest of the family, I suppose some people need to keep parts of themselves private, especially when they've spent a lifetime maintaining a certain image." I considered this as I signed the documents. Are there other secrets I should know about? Other aspects of this company that operate on emotion rather than business sense? Barbara smiled slightly. "Coleman Properties has always been more than a business, Margaret. It's a legacy, a reputation, a responsibility to the community." Harold understood that balance. He believed you would too. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Eleanor's hidden compassion, about the company's untapped potential, about Thomas and the decades we had spent in a marriage that now felt like a carefully maintained facade. We had both been performing roles. He, the dutiful son and heir, me, the appropriate wife. Neither of us had truly been seen, perhaps not even by each other. At midnight, I made a decision. I called the front desk and arranged for a car, then dressed quickly in jeans and a sweater, clothes Eleanor would consider inappropriate for a Coleman, but that felt authentically like me. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside the Coleman estate, using my key for what might be the last time. The house was dark except for a light in the library. I followed it, unsurprised to find Eleanor sitting in one of the leather chairs, a book open on her lap, though she wasn't reading. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "I wondered when you would come," she said. "I visited Hamilton Street today," I replied, taking the chair opposite her. Something flickered. In her eyes, surprise, perhaps defensiveness. "Did you? Why didn't you ever tell me about your work there? All these years I thought I knew who you were." Eleanor closed her book carefully. "You knew who I needed to be as Harold's wife, as the matriarch of this family. That was not a role that allowed for other considerations. Like compassion? Like genuine human connection?" She flinched slightly. "You wouldn't understand." "I understand more than you think, Eleanor. I understand what it means to play a role for so long you forget there was ever anything else." For a long moment she studied me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time. "Why are you here, Margaret?" "I want to understand why Harold..." chose me. What he saw that the rest of you missed. Eleanor sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. Harold was a builder, of businesses, of legacies. He believed the future belonged to those who could adapt, who could see, beyond tradition while respecting its foundations. She paused. My sons are good men, but they are maintainers, not builders. They would preserve Coleman Properties exactly as it is until it slowly declined into irrelevance. And me? What did he see in me? Hunger, she said simply. The outsider's perspective. The ability to endure dismissal and still stand tall. The compassion he pretended not to value, but secretly admired. She smiled faintly. Also, he respected how you managed household finances. Did you know he reviewed the accounts? You stretched your allowance further than he expected, invested the surplus wisely. Small scale, but revealing. I hadn't known that either. More evidence of Harold's silent observation. The children's table, I said, the humiliation still fresh. Was that your idea? Eleanor had the decency to look ashamed. Yes. I wanted to see if you would finally stand up for yourself after all these years. If you had, Harold would have known you weren't right for this role. He wanted someone who would endure humiliation without complaint. He wanted someone who understood that sometimes you must accept temporary indignity to achieve a greater purpose. She leaned forward. The business world isn't kind, Margaret. Neither is this family. He needed to know you could withstand both. The revelation was both disturbing and strangely validating. My years of patient endurance hadn't been weakness. They had been strength misidentified. What happens now? I asked, echoing the question that had been asked of me repeatedly since the will reading. That depends on you, Eleanor replied. What do you want to happen? The question caught me off guard. No one in the Coleman family had ever asked what I wanted, not meaningfully. I want to honor Harold's faith in me, I said slowly. I want to build something meaningful from what he left me. And I want to be truly seen, not just tolerated. Eleanor nodded. And Thomas? My son? This was the question I had been avoiding. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know if our marriage can survive this change. Perhaps it shouldn't, Eleanor said, surprising me again. Perhaps you both deserve something more authentic than what you've settled for. We sat in silence for several minutes, two women who had spent decades performing different versions of the same role, finally seeing each other clearly. I should go, I said eventually, rising from the chair. Eleanor remained seated but looked up at me with new respect in her eyes. Margaret, she said as I reached the door. Hamilton Street. Whatever you decide about those properties, the people there matter to me. I nodded. I'll remember that. As I drove back to the hotel, I felt a strange lightness. The conversation with Eleanor had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the past 26 years. I hadn't been merely tolerated. I had been tested, evaluated, and ultimately selected for a purpose beyond anything I had imagined, for myself. The question now was what I would do with this unexpected inheritance, not just the business, but the freedom to finally define myself on my own terms. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic moment when I suddenly became the confident CEO. No cinematic scene where I strode into a boardroom and silenced doubters with brilliant business strategy. Instead, change came in small moments of courage, in quiet decisions, to trust my instincts, in the gradual recognition that I was more capable than I had been allowed to believe. 3 weeks after the reading of Harold's will, I moved out of the hotel and into a small but elegant apartment overlooking the river. Thomas had been incredulous when I informed him of my decision. A separation? After 26 years? He asked, standing in my office doorway, his voice carefully controlled but his hands betraying his agitation as they gripped the doorframe. Is that really necessary, Margaret? It's not a legal separation, I clarified. Just space. I need to understand who I am outside of our marriage, outside of the role I've played for so long. This isn't like you, he said, shaking his head. That's exactly the point, Thomas. What if this is exactly like me? What if you've never really known who I am because I've spent 26 years becoming what you and your family needed me to be? The truth of those words struck us both into silence. Thomas's expression shifted from frustration to something more complex, perhaps the first glimmerings of genuine self-reflection. I don't want to lose you, he said finally, his voice softer. I studied him, trying to see beyond the handsome, privileged man I had married to the person beneath. I'm not sure you ever really had me, Thomas, not the real me. He left without further argument, and I felt a curious mixture of sadness and liberation. That evening, I signed the lease on the apartment, my name alone on a document that would shape my life. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The apartment became my sanctuary, a place untouched by Coleman family history or expectations. I furnished it simply, but to my own taste. Comfortable furniture, colorful artwork by local artists, bookshelves filled with volumes I had always wanted to read but never found time for. My nursing textbooks came out of storage, a reminder of the career I had abandoned, but the knowledge I still carried. At Coleman Properties, I settled into a routine that balanced learning the business with implementing careful changes. I started small, creating a more formal process for employees to suggest innovations, commissioning an independent audit of our development practices, scheduling regular site visits to properties I had only known as line items in reports. The resistance from Thomas and Richard continued, but evolved from outright opposition to subtle undermining. They would forget to include me in key meetings, present decisions as already finalized, or explain complex issues in deliberately technical language. I countered by doing my homework, studying industry publications late into the night, consulting discreetly with experts in commercial real estate, and always coming prepared with thoughtful questions. My first real test came with the quarterly board meeting. As majority shareholder, I would be chairing the gathering of Coleman Properties Board of Directors. 8 men, all long-standing friends or business associates of Harold, all watching to see if his widow's nurse of a daughter-in-law would fall flat on her face. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I paced my new apartment, reviewing presentation materials, rehearsing responses to potential challenges. Around midnight, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Hello? I answered cautiously. Margaret, it's Barbara. I hope I'm not calling. Too late. Not at all, I assured her. I'm just preparing for tomorrow. That's why I'm calling. I thought you should know that Thomas and Richard have been meeting with several board members privately. They've been suggesting that Harold's decision was influenced by his failing health, that you're in over your head. My stomach tightened. I expected as much. Any specific concerns they're raising? The Westlake development primarily. They're suggesting you don't understand the financial implications of the delays. The Westlake development was one of Coleman Properties' most ambitious projects, a mixed-use complex with retail, office space, and luxury condominiums. It was behind schedule and over budget, a situation I had been investigating but hadn't yet addressed publicly. Thank you for letting me know, Barbara. There's something else, she added. Harold kept a separate file on Westlake. It's not in the main project records. I can bring it to your apartment tonight if you'd like. An hour later, Barbara sat at my kitchen counter as I pored over the documents she had brought. They revealed what the official reports had obscured. The Westlake delays weren't just bad luck or typical construction setbacks. There had been serious mismanagement, primarily by the development firm owned by Richard's college roommate. Did Harold know about this? I asked, looking up from the damning evidence. Barbara nodded. He was gathering information to make changes. Before he died, he intended to remove Richard from oversight of the project. Why wasn't this in the official files? Harold believed in giving family every chance to correct their mistakes privately before facing public consequences. He was old-fashioned that way. I considered the implications. So tomorrow, when they try to use Westlake against me, you'll be better prepared than they expect, she finished with a small smile. The board meeting began at 9 the next morning. I arrived early, greeting each member personally as they arrived. I had researched them all, memorizing not just their business backgrounds but personal details, children's names, charitable interests, hobbies, small connections that subtly established me as more than just an uninformed interloper. Thomas and Richard arrived last, Thomas nodding stiffly in my direction while Richard pretended not to see me at all. I called the meeting to order, moving through the agenda methodically, presenting quarterly results with a calm confidence that belied my racing heart. And now, the Westlake development update, I said, reaching the point I knew they had been waiting for. As you're all aware, this project is significantly behind schedule and over budget. Richard shifted in his seat, a smug expression settling on his face. Here it comes, his look seemed to say. What you may not be aware of, I continued, is why? I distributed a document to each board member, a concise, clear summary of the mismanagement issues I had discovered in Harold's private files. This analysis shows a pattern of questionable decisions by Meridian Development Group, resulting in approximately $3 million in unnecessary expenditures and 6 months of avoidable delays. The board members began reviewing the document, their expressions growing increasingly concerned. Richard's face had drained of color. Meridian is run by Stephen Woods, I believe. I asked innocently, looking at Richard. Your former roommate from Princeton? This is highly inappropriate, Richard sputtered. These allegations are documented in the company's own records, I finished for him. Records that should have been available to the board all along. I turned to address the full table. Gentlemen, I came to this role unexpectedly, but I take it seriously. I've spent the past month learning everything I can about this company, its strengths, its challenges, and unfortunately, its blind spots. I laid out my proposed solution, replacing Meridian with a more experienced development firm, implementing stricter oversight protocols, and creating a realistic timeline for completion that would reassure investors and buyers who had already committed to the project. This will require writing off certain losses, I acknowledged. But it will position Westlake for success rather than continuing to conceal problems until they become insurmountable. The discussion that followed was intense but productive. Several board members asked pointed questions that revealed their own expertise, which I welcomed rather than deflected. By the meeting's end, my plan had been approved unanimously, with Richard abstaining and Thomas, surprisingly, voting in favor. As the board members filed out, several stopped to shake my hand or offer brief words of encouragement. The initial test had been passed, not with flashy showmanship, but with thorough preparation and straightforward honesty. Thomas lingered after the others had gone. You knew, he said simply. Yes. How long? Since last night, I admitted. But that's not the point, Thomas. The point is that I looked for answers when things didn't add up, instead of accepting the narrative I was given. He nodded slowly. Richard is furious. I imagine he is. He's talking about contesting the will again, claiming undue influence. I sighed. That would be unfortunate for everyone, including him. Harold's decision can be legally proven sound, and a public fight would only damage the company's reputation. Thomas studied me with new awareness. You've changed, Margaret. No, I corrected him gently. I've always been this person. I just never had the opportunity to show it, or perhaps the courage to insist on it. As spring turned to summer, I settled more confidently into my role at Coleman Properties. The board meeting had marked a turning point, not an end to resistance, but a shift in how I was perceived. I was no longer merely Harold's surprising choice. I was becoming a leader in my own right. I implemented changes gradually but decisively. The Westlake project was back on track with new management. Our sustainability initiatives were expanded, with a commitment to making all new developments carbon neutral. Most significantly, I launched a new division focused on affordable housing, quality homes and apartments for working families, built with the same attention to detail as our luxury properties. This last decision provoked the most opposition from Thomas and Richard. Coleman Properties has always been synonymous with luxury, Richard argued during a particularly heated executive meeting. This affordable housing nonsense will dilute our brand. Times change, I replied calmly. The housing crisis affects every city where we operate. We can be part of the problem or part of the solution. Very noble, he sneered. But this is business, not charity. It's both good ethics and good business, I countered. We've secured tax incentives that make these projects financially viable. We're diversifying our portfolio to weather market fluctuations, and we're creating goodwill in communities where we want to continue developing for decades to come. The Affordable Housing Initiative moved forward despite their objections. I named it the Eleanor Coleman Housing Foundation, a gesture that surprised my mother-in-law but seemed to touch her deeply. She had continued her quiet support of the Hamilton Street tenants, and this new initiative aligned with that hidden part of her nature. You didn't need to use my name, she told me over tea in my office. It was the first time she had visited Coleman Properties since Harold's death. I wanted to, I replied. It honors something real about you, something true that most people never see. Eleanor studied her teacup thoughtfully. Harold would have approved of this direction for the company. He was more sentimental than he let on, more concerned with legacy beyond just profit. Did you know what he was planning? With the will? She shook her head. Not specifically, but I knew he was. Reevaluating things in his final months, thinking deeply about what would happen after he was gone. She looked up at me, her gaze direct. He made the right choice, Margaret. I wouldn't have said that 3 months ago, but I see it now. Coming from Eleanor, this was the highest possible praise. Our relationship had shifted from cold tolerance to something approaching mutual respect. Not warm, perhaps never that, but genuine in a way it had never been before. My relationship with Thomas, meanwhile, existed in a strange limbo. We met frequently for business, occasionally for dinner to discuss practical matters related to our separation. He had moved into the guest wing of the Coleman estate while I remained in my Riverside apartment. Neither of us had filed for divorce, but neither were we working toward reconciliation. Are you happy? He asked me one evening as we finished dinner at a quiet restaurant. With all of this, the company, the apartment, the distance between us? I considered the question seriously. I'm not sure happy is the right word. I'm fulfilled in ways I never expected to be. I'm discovering capabilities I didn't know I had. I'm making decisions based on what I believe rather than what others expect. I paused. But there's a loneliness to it as well. You could come home, he offered, not for the first time. To what, Thomas? To the way things were? I don't think either of us can go back to that now. He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. What if it could be different? What if we could start again, knowing what we know now? The question lingered between us, heavy with possibility, but also with doubt. We had spent 26 years in a marriage of convenience and appearance, a partnership that functioned smoothly, but lacked true intimacy. Could we build something authentic from such a foundation? I wasn't sure. I need more time, I told him honestly. I'm still discovering who I am outside of being Mrs. Thomas Coleman. He withdrew his hand, disappointed but not angry. I understand. For what it's worth, I like who you're becoming, even when it makes my professional life more challenging. I smiled at that. Only a Coleman would consider that a compliment. True, he acknowledged with a small laugh, but I mean it nonetheless. As the 6-month anniversary of Harold's death approached, I found myself thinking more about his letter, about the faith he had placed in me when everyone else had written me off. I visited his grave on a warm autumn afternoon, placing a simple bouquet against the imposing family headstone. I hope you'd be pleased, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to express the thought. I'm trying to honor your vision while creating my own. He would be, came a voice from behind me. I turned to find Barbara standing a few feet away, holding her own flowers. Sorry to intrude. I visit every month. No intrusion, I assured her. It's nice to know someone else remembers him as more than just a business legend. We stood in companionable silence for a few moments before Barbara spoke again. There's something I've been meaning to give you. Harold left it with instructions that I should wait until I felt you were ready. She handed me a small envelope, similar to the one I had received at the will reading, but smaller, more personal. Thank you, I said, turning it over in my hands. How did you know I was ready now? Barbara smiled. The Affordable Housing Initiative. It was the kind of bold move Harold hoped you would make. Compassionate, but also strategically sound. That's when I knew you had truly found your footing. After she left, I sat on a nearby bench and opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, worn around the edges, clearly carried for years. It showed a much younger Harold standing proudly in front of a modest apartment building. On the back, in faded ink, First property, 1965. Remember where you started. The image struck me deeply. Harold Coleman, the imposing patriarch, the business titan, had begun with something small, something humble. He had built his empire step by step, decision by decision. Just as I was now building my own version of success, my own definition of a life well lived. I tucked the photo carefully into my purse, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The path forward wasn't clear. Not for Coleman Properties, not for my marriage, not for my personal journey. But I no longer needed absolute certainty. I had found something more valuable. Trust in my own capacity to navigate the unknown. That evening, I sat on the balcony of my apartment as twilight settled over the river. 6 months ago, I had been the silent wife at the children's table, invisible despite my presence. Now I carried the weight of a company's future, the responsibility of employees' livelihoods, the emerging understanding of my own worth. My phone rang. Thomas, calling for the 3rd time that week with no urgent business to discuss, just the increasingly transparent desire to maintain connection. Hello, Thomas, I answered, watching a boat glide silently down the darkening river. Margaret, he replied, his voice warming at my response. I was wondering if you might join me for dinner tomorrow. There's a new exhibition at the art museum I thought you might enjoy. The invitation held no pressure, no expectations, just an opening, an opportunity for something new to grow in the space between who we had been and who we were becoming. Yes, I decided, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. I'd like that. We weren't the same people who had entered into that convenient marriage 26 years ago. We would never return to the patterns that had defined us for so long. But perhaps with time and intention, we could create something more authentic from the remnants of our shared past, not because tradition demanded it, but because we chose it freely, with open eyes and honest hearts. As night fell fully, I remained on the balcony, contemplating the journey that had brought me here and the path that stretched ahead. The lawyer had called my name, and everyone had frozen in shock. But that moment hadn't defined me nearly as much as what came after, the daily decisions to stand tall, to learn quickly, to lead with both compassion and clarity. I had spent decades making myself smaller to fit into a world that never truly welcomed me. Now I was expanding into the full measure of my capabilities, discovering that the greatest inheritance Harold had left me wasn't his company, but his confidence in my capacity to grow beyond the limitations others had placed upon me. The children's table had been meant as humiliation, but it had become the catalyst for my liberation. Sometimes the lowest moments contain within them the seeds of our greatest strength, if only we have the courage to nurture them into bloom. 1 year to the day after Harold's will reading, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Westlake Hotel, our newest property, completed on time and under the revised budget. The room was filled with investors, city officials, employees, and press, all gathered for the official opening. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth, yet looking out at the crowd, I felt a sense of accomplishment that once would have seemed impossible. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice steady and confident in a way that still occasionally surprised me. A year ago, the Westlake development was troubled, behind schedule, over budget, and in danger of becoming a cautionary tale rather than a crown jewel. Today, it stands as a testament to what can be accomplished when vision meets perseverance. From my position on the stage, I could see Thomas in the front row, watching me with quiet pride. Next to him sat Eleanor, elegant as always but somehow softer around the edges. Richard was notably absent. He had resigned from Coleman Properties 6 months earlier to start his own development firm, unable to accept the changes I had implemented. His departure had been difficult, but ultimately necessary for both of us. "Westlake represents the future of Coleman Properties," I continued. "A future that honors our tradition of excellence while embracing innovation, sustainability, and community integration." I gestured toward the scale model displayed on stage, a perfect miniature of the completed complex with its distinctive curved architecture and extensive green spaces. But Westlake is just the beginning. Today, I'm pleased to announce our newest initiative, the Coleman Community Development Fund. This $50 million commitment will support affordable housing, public spaces, and economic opportunity in every city where we operate. Murmurs rippled through the audience. This was no small gesture. It represented a fundamental shift in how Coleman Properties defined its role and responsibilities. Some of the older investors looked concerned, while the younger ones leaned forward with interest. "Business success and social responsibility are not opposing forces," I said, addressing the skepticism I could sense. "They are complementary strengths that, when balanced properly, create sustainable value for everyone: investors, employees, residents, and communities." I concluded my remarks and stepped away from the podium to warm applause. As people rose, for the reception portion of the evening, many approached to offer congratulations or ask questions about the new initiative. I moved through these conversations with an ease that had been hard-won over months of similar interactions. No longer did I feel like an imposter in Harold's world. I had created my own space within it. Barbara appeared at my elbow, discreetly, handing me a glass of sparkling water. "The mayor would like a word when you have a moment," she murmured. "And the reporter from the Business Journal is hoping for a brief interview." "Thank you, Barbara. I'll speak with them shortly." I took a sip of water, grateful for her steady presence. She had become more than an assistant. She was my most trusted advisor, the institutional memory that helped me navigate complex relationships and histories I hadn't been part of. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit approached, hand extended. "Mrs. Coleman, James Harrington, Meridian Investments. Impressive speech." I shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I'm glad you could join us. Your community fund announcement caught my attention. Bold move." His tone made it unclear whether he considered it bold in a positive or negative sense. "Necessary move," I corrected with a smile. The communities where we build are the foundation of our success. Investing in their stability and growth is just good business. Some of your investors might disagree. Some already have, I acknowledged. But our returns over the past years speak for themselves. We're up 17% in a market that's averaging 9%. Harrington raised an eyebrow, clearly not having expected me to know those figures offhand. True, though 1 year hardly establishes a trend. Which is why we're committed to demonstrating consistent results over time. I maintained eye contact, neither defensive nor apologetic about my vision. If you have specific concerns about our direction, I'd be happy to discuss them in more detail at your convenience. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. I might take you up on that. Good evening, Mrs. Coleman. As he walked away, Thomas appeared at my side. Harrington controls a significant investment block, he observed quietly. He could make trouble if he wanted to. He could try, I replied. But our numbers are solid, and most of the board is firmly behind our new direction. I turned to face Thomas more directly. How are you holding up? These events were never your favorite. He smiled ruefully. Better than I used to. It's easier when I'm not carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. The past year had changed Thomas as well, softened him in some ways, strengthened him in others. Freed from the pressure of being Harold's heir apparent, he had found his own niche within the company, focusing on the architectural and design aspects he genuinely enjoyed, rather than the financial and strategic elements that had always felt like obligation. Our relationship had evolved too. After months of careful distance, we had gradually begun rebuilding on a new foundation, one based on mutual respect and genuine choice rather than convenience or expectation. We were dating, essentially, getting to know each other as the people. We truly were rather than the roles we had played for so long. The ceremony went well, Thomas observed, surveying the crowded room. You've won over most of the skeptics. Not all, I noted, spotting a cluster of older investors who had been resistant to many of my changes. Some still see me as the nurse who married above her station, the interloper who shouldn't be trusted with Harold's legacy. Their loss, Thomas said firmly. Anyone paying attention can see you've strengthened that legacy, not diminished it. His support still surprised me sometimes, the genuine admiration that had replaced his initial resistance. It hadn't been an easy transformation for either of us, but it had been real, built on honest conversations and difficult reckonings with our shared past. The evening continued with the practiced rhythm of such corporate events, conversations that blended business and pleasantry, strategic networking, the delicate dance of relationships that formed the invisible foundation of the business world. I moved through it with increasing confidence, no longer the outsider struggling to belong, but the leader setting the tone. Later, as the crowd began to thin, I stepped out onto the hotel's rooftop terrace for a moment of quiet. The city stretched. Before me, lights twinkling against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that landscape were the Hamilton Street properties, Eleanor's secret commitment to the community that had once tried to help her family. And scattered throughout were our newer developments, including the first completed building of the Eleanor Coleman Housing Foundation. Quite a view, isn't it? Eleanor's voice came from behind me. She joined me at the railing, elegant in midnight blue with her signature pearls. Harold would have been pleased with Westlake. It has his sense of scale, but your attention to detail. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by the compliment. That means a lot coming from you. I haven't always been kind to you, Margaret, she acknowledged, her gaze still on the city below. I regret that now. The admission startled me. Eleanor Coleman was not a woman who expressed regret easily. We all did the best we could with the roles we were given, I offered. She turned to me, her expression serious. That's generous of you, but not entirely accurate. I chose my role and enforced its limitations rigidly, on myself and on others. I could have welcomed you, mentored you, shared the strategies I had developed for navigating this world. Instead, I treated you as a threat to be contained. Why are you telling me this now? I asked quietly. Because tonight I watched you announce a $50 million community initiative named after me, she said with a small smile. An initiative that honors the part of me I kept hidden for decades. It seems like the least I can do is acknowledge the truth between us. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, a peace between us I would never have thought possible a year ago. The family is gathering for dinner next Sunday, Eleanor said eventually. Richard and Vanessa will be there with the children. I'd like you to come. Thomas mentioned you two have been reconnecting. The invitation surprised me. Sunday dinners at the Coleman estate had been mandatory family occasions for years, but since Harold's death and the upheaval that followed, they had become irregular at best. That Eleanor was reinstating the tradition and explicitly including me despite the tensions with Richard was significant. I'd be honored, I replied sincerely. Good. She smoothed an already immaculate sleeve. I've instructed the staff to set places for everyone at the main table, all of us together, as it should be. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. No more children's table, no more hierarchy of belonging. A small gesture, but a meaningful one. Eleanor left me to my thoughts, returning to the reception. I remained on the terrace a while longer, reflecting on the journey of the past year, from invisibility to leadership, from compliance to conviction. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, confronted weaknesses I hadn't wanted to acknowledge, and built something uniquely mine from the unexpected opportunity Harold had provided. The following week brought a new challenge. The Planning Commission meeting for our latest affordable housing development had drawn unexpected opposition from a neighborhood association concerned about property values and changing the character of their area. I sat in the crowded City Hall chamber, listening as residents voiced increasingly heated objections. This kind of development will bring crime and congestion to our neighborhood, claimed one particularly vocal man. Coleman Properties may call it affordable housing, but we all know what that really means. The thinly veiled prejudice in his statement made my jaw tighten. I had anticipated some resistance, but not the level of organized opposition that had materialized. Looking around the room, I could see that the commissioners themselves seemed uncomfortable with the tone of the comments, but uncertain how to redirect the conversation. When my turn to speak came, I approached the podium with a calm, I didn't entirely feel. This project mattered deeply to me. It represented everything I believed Coleman Properties could and should be in the communities we served. Good evening, I began. I'm Margaret Coleman, CEO of Coleman Properties. I appreciate the concerns that have been raised tonight, and I'd like to address them directly. I nodded to my assistant, who distributed folders to each commissioner. These materials provide detailed information about our proposed development, including traffic studies, environmental impact assessments, and security plans. I glanced around the room, making eye contact with some of the most vocal opponents. But numbers and studies don't tell the complete story, so let me speak plainly about what this development is and isn't. For the next 10 minutes, I outlined our vision. High-quality homes for essential workers, teachers, firefighters, and healthcare providers who were currently being priced out of the neighborhoods they served. I shared examples of our completed projects in other cities and the positive impacts they had made. Most importantly, I spoke from personal conviction rather than corporate calculation. 27 years ago, I was a pediatric nurse struggling to afford decent housing in this very city, I told them. I understand the dignity that comes from having a safe, beautiful place to call home, not as charity, but as something earned, through hard work and contribution to the community. When I finished, a thoughtful silence fell over the room. The first question came from a commissioner who had seemed skeptical throughout the earlier discussion. Mrs. Coleman, your presentation is compelling, But frankly, it's at odds with Coleman Properties' historical focus on luxury developments. Why should we believe this isn't just a token project or a tax write-off? It was a fair question, one that required an honest answer rather than corporate spin. Because Coleman Properties is evolving, I said simply. Under my leadership, we're expanding our vision of success to include positive community impact alongside financial returns. This isn't a side project. It's a core element of our business strategy moving forward. I gestured to the renderings displayed on the chamber's screens. We're bringing the same quality, attention to detail, and commitment to excellence that defines our luxury properties to these developments, not because it maximizes short-term profit, but because it's the right thing to do for the long-term health of this city and our company. The meeting continued for another hour, with questions becoming increasingly substantive rather than reactionary. By the time the commission voted to approve our permits, with conditions that were reasonable and anticipated, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simply winning a business victory. This was the kind of work that gave meaning to Harold's unexpected choice that justified the upheaval of the past year. As I gathered my materials to leave, a young woman approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Coleman, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm a teacher at Riverside Elementary, and right now I commute almost an hour each way because I can't afford to live closer. This project could change that for me and my colleagues." Her words reminded me of why this work mattered. The real lives affected by decisions made in boardrooms and planning commissions. "Thank you for speaking up tonight," I told her. "Your perspective is exactly what the commissioners needed to hear." Outside the chamber, I found Thomas waiting. He hadn't attended the meeting, understanding that this particular project was one I needed to champion personally, but he had come to hear the outcome. "Congratulations," he said as I approached. "Barbara texted me about the approval." "It was closer than I would have liked," I admitted. "The opposition was more organized than we anticipated." "But you prevailed." He smiled, offering his arm as we walked toward the parking garage, "as you tend to do these days." The casual confidence in his statement struck me. A year ago, neither of us would have imagined me successfully navigating a contentious public hearing, let alone leading the company through a significant strategic shift. Yet here we were, both transformed by circumstances neither of us had chosen, but both had ultimately embraced. "Join me for dinner?" Thomas suggested as we reached our cars. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you." An hour later, we sat at a quiet table in our favorite restaurant, a small Italian place far from the usual Coleman haunts, where the owner knew us by name and never rushed our conversations. After our meals arrived and the waiter had retreated, Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "I had a visit from Barbara today," he began, turning the envelope in his hands. "She said it was time to give you this." I recognized the stationery immediately, the same cream-colored paper as Harold's previous letters to me. "Another message. From beyond?" I asked, only half joking. "Apparently." Thomas handed it over. Barbara said Harold left several letters with specific instructions about when each should be delivered. This one was marked, "When she has proven herself beyond doubt." My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the envelope. Harold's posthumous guidance had been uncannily well-timed thus far, each message arriving just when I needed its particular wisdom. What could this one contain? "Do you want privacy?" Thomas asked gently. I shook my head. "No. Whatever it says, we can share it." I broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in Harold's distinctive handwriting. "Margaret, if you're reading this, you've done more than survive the transition. You've thrived. You've faced opposition, overcome doubts, your own and others, and begun to shape the company according to your vision, rather than simply maintaining what came before. I knew you had this strength. I saw it in how you endured Eleanor's coldness, in how you maintained your dignity despite being marginalized, in how you built a life of meaning within constraints that would have broken many others. What you may not yet fully understand is why I chose you rather than simply dividing the company between Thomas and Richard. The truth is that neither of my sons possessed what Coleman properties most needed: the perspective of someone who had lived outside privilege, who understood the value of what others take for granted. Thomas has always had more potential than he realized, but he needed to be freed from the weight of expectation to find it. Richard's path is his own to determine. But you, Margaret, you were the catalyst this family and this company needed, whether any of us knew it or not. There is one final piece of my plan that Barbara has been instructed to implement only upon receiving confirmation that you have truly taken the reins. By now, you should have access to an additional account containing shares I purchased privately. Over the years, minority interests in complementary businesses that will give Coleman Properties new opportunities for growth and collaboration. This is not a test or a challenge, simply the completion of the transition. Use these resources wisely, as I believe you will. The company now truly belongs to you, not because of my decision, but because you have earned it through your actions, since I've been gone. With pride and confidence, I read the letter twice, then handed it to Thomas. As he read, I sat back in my chair, absorbing the implications. More than the additional assets, which were certainly significant, it was Harold's explicit statement of confidence that affected me most deeply. You have earned it through your actions. Not inherited, not been given. Earned. Thomas folded the letter carefully and returned it to me. He was right about you, he said quietly, and about me. What do you mean? Being freed from the weight of expectation, he quoted. This past year has been clarifying. For the first time, I'm doing what I want to do rather than what I'm expected to do. He reached across the table to take my hand, including rebuilding my relationship with you, the real you, not the convenient wife I took for granted for too long. His honesty touched me. We had both been changed by Harold's decision, forced to confront uncomfortable truths, to grow in ways we would never have chosen voluntarily. The result was a relationship more genuine than anything we had shared in our first 26 years together. The Sunday dinner at Eleanor's, I said, remembering her invitation. It won't be easy with Richard there. He still blames me for everything. Probably, Thomas agreed. But families are complicated. We don't have to pretend otherwise anymore. That simple statement encapsulated so much of what had changed. No more performances, no more maintaining appearances at the cost of authenticity. We could acknowledge the messy reality of family dynamics without feeling obligated to smooth them over for appearance's sake. The following Sunday, I arrived at the Coleman estate feeling strangely calm, despite the potential for tension. Thomas met me at the door, taking my hand as we walked into the house that had once intimidated me, but now felt like simply a place, impressive but no longer threatening. In the formal dining room, Eleanor had indeed arranged places for everyone at the main table: Richard and Vanessa, their 3 children, now teenagers, Thomas, and me. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was sincere, a visible declaration that the family hierarchy had been permanently altered. Richard's greeting was cool but civil. Vanessa managed a tight smile. The children, surprisingly, seemed genuinely pleased to see me, especially the youngest, Emily, who had recently developed an interest in architecture and wanted to tell me about a project she was working on for school. As we settled into our seats, Eleanor stood briefly to raise her glass. To family, she said simply, in all its complicated, evolving forms. We drank to that imperfect but honest toast. The conversation that followed was sometimes strained, occasionally warm, never entirely comfortable, but real in a way that previous family gatherings had rarely been. Richard spoke guardedly about his new venture. Vanessa mentioned committee work she was involved with. The children discussed school and activities, normal family conversation, neither performative nor hostile. Near the end of the meal, Eleanor surprised me by saying, "Margaret, I visited the new housing development last week. The one on Parkside Avenue. It's quite impressive." Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You went to see one of her projects?" Eleanor turned to him calmly. "I did. As the namesake of the foundation, I felt I should understand what's being created under my name." She returned her attention to me. "The attention to detail is exceptional. Those families will have homes they can be proud of." "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by her approval. "That means a great deal coming from you." From across the table, Emily spoke up. "I'd like to see it too. The development. Maybe you could show me sometime, Aunt Margaret." The title she used, Aunt Margaret, hit me unexpectedly. For years, the children had called me that out of obligation, the proper term for their uncle's wife. But Emily's tone held genuine interest, even admiration. "I'd be happy to," I told her warmly. "Perhaps next weekend? The landscaping is being installed now. You might find the process interesting for your project." As conversations continued, around the table, I caught Thomas watching me with a soft expression I couldn't quite interpret. Later, as we gathered our things to leave, he pulled me aside in the hallway. "What is it?" I asked, still puzzled by his thoughtful gaze. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he said quietly. "A year ago, you were seated at the children's table in this very house. Today, you're mentoring the next generation and earning respect even from those who resisted you most strongly." The observation struck me deeply. The change had been so gradual, so incremental that I hadn't fully appreciated its magnitude until Thomas articulated it. From invisible to essential, from tolerated to respected, from passenger to driver of my own life. It wasn't what any of us planned, I acknowledged, but I'm grateful for where it's led. He leaned forward and kissed me gently, not the perfunctory gesture of our old life together, but something more meaningful, more choice-filled. So am I. As we drove away from the Coleman estate, I thought about the journey of the past year. The shock of the will reading, the struggle to find my footing, the gradual discovery of capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, the rebuilding of relationships on more authentic foundations. The lawyer had called my name that day, and everyone had frozen in disbelief. But the real story wasn't that dramatic moment. It was everything that came after. The daily decisions to stand tall, to learn quickly, to lead with both compassion and clarity. The willingness to be uncomfortable, to make mistakes, to grow beyond the limitations others had placed upon me. I had spent decades making myself smaller to fit into a world that never truly welcomed me. Now I occupied my full space, not aggressively, not apologetically, but with the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who I was and what I had to offer. The children's table had been meant as humiliation, but it had become the catalyst for my liberation. Harold had seen potential in me that I hadn't recognized in myself, but bringing that potential to life had been my own achievement. One decision, one challenge, one victory at a time. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all. Our lives are not defined by the tables where others seat us, but by our courage to rise and claim places of our own making. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.